Greetings, friends of liberty. All in all, I must say that here in 18th century England, one needs to keep one's blade at a short distance, given our plenitude of dark alleys and highwaymen in the countryside. And yet the number of ruffians in the street is likely declining, given what we know of their frequency earlier in the century. Then we had the Mohawks, a band of rich young roustabouts, noted for vicious acts of tomfoolery, such as the cutting off of noses and the rolling of old ladies down hillsides in barrels. And even earlier, numerous London street gangs, such as the Hocobites, the Damned Crew, the Muns, the Hectors, the Scours, and the Knickers, all a proliferation of violent dunscaps. However, if we turn likewise to the declines in violence of your 20th and 21st centuries, we find a thinker who has written a massive 802-page tome on just this topic, Dr. Steven Pinker, well-known academic psychologist at Harvard University. In this book, Dr. Pinker, not lacking in intellectual confidence, as is typical of Harvardians, begins addressing this complicated topic by dispelling one of the modern urban legends about hunter-gatherers and the Romans and Greeks of antiquity, the myth that they lived in more peaceful times than ours. And he begins dispelling the myth by mentioning the famous case of the Tyrolean Iceman Ötzi, his body discovered in 1991 by hikers thawing in the Alps about 300 feet on the Italian side of its border with Austria near the village of Bolzano. Ötzi was killed over 5,000 years ago, partly by an arrow to the back and partly by other injuries, likely in violent conflict. As Pinker subsequently shows, Ötzi's death was not atypical but highly representative, not only of human prehistory but man's entire early attempts at civilization. The Trojan War, of course, was fought over one woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. Now, I value women as much as any romantic, but a whole war over the equivalent, with all due respect, of Cindy Crawford? And thus, one of the main tasks that Dr. Pinker sets himself in this book is to describe all that early violence, which many modern readers will deny, and to show its rate of decline through the ages. And this he does in superlative fashion. How? Number one, he shows us that the rate of violence among hunter-gatherers, both ancient and modern, was and is actually quite high, because while they don't have battles like Verdun or the Somme, they do have constant endemic strife against other tribes and constant blood feuds and disagreements within their own communities. Both causes, in the end, kill a much higher percentage of people over time. One study that examined 900 deaths in pre-Columbian America found 13.4% violent deaths for hunter-gatherers and only 2.7% for individuals who lived in states like the Maya, Aztec, and Inca empires. 13.4 against 2.7%. Number two, this bias, if you scratch a noble savage that you really end up with an Indian Quaker, was incidentally not only found among the average citizen, but also among modern anthropologists. And being the liberals that they usually are, they wrote books with titles like The Harmless People, For the Kung of the Kalahari, or Never in Anger about the Inuit. But when more sober-minded researchers investigated actual rates of violence, these alleged noble savages turned out to be quite ferocious. Number three, given how unproductive Stone Age societies were, it's not surprising that they turned to cannibalism to fulfill their protein requirements, so often, in fact, that modern geneticists argue that our genome developed the specific way that it did to avoid some of the destructive diseases transmitted by eating human flesh. Number four, Pinker proceeds out of the Stone Age and into more modern times to describe how one of the most revered books of Western civilization, the Bible, is filled, as we all know, with hundreds of examples of bloodshed and mayhem, it being, as he says, one long celebration of violence. The very symbol of Christianity, the cross, denoting the crucifixion, meant that for Christians, acknowledging that this sadistic murder was a gift of divine mercy, people could earn eternal life. And if they failed to see the logic in all this, their flesh would be seared by fire for all eternity. Number 5, moving to the Middle Ages, he notes that those fabled knights of the Round Table were known not just for their exploits in tournaments and on the field of battle, but for, A, not always seeming to understand that no means no, when pronounced from the lips of very fair damsels, B, in addition, actually promising to their ladies to rape beautiful other women as a favor to them, and C, for sending their ladies as a trophy the heads of conquered knights. This is not the custom currently. Number 6, moving to the New World, he quotes William Bradford, leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, describing how Indians would use the sharp edges of shellfish to scrape off huge chunks of flesh from their living captives, roast those Indian McNuggets, and then eat them before the eyes of the captives. That is uncivilized. Number 7, moving finally to the modern world, he notes how dueling, at least with pistols and swords, has disappeared, how the frequency of spanking and bullying has radically declined. He remarks how the kidnapping of children, despite scares in the media to the contrary, has gone down, saying the annual number of abductions by strangers has ranged from 200 to 300 in the 1990s to about 100 today. With 50 million children in the United States, that works out to an average annual homicide rate of 1 in a million. He observes how the treatment of animals in laboratories and in slaughterhouses has become more humane. And finally, he describes at length and with apparent approval the rise of veganism. Number 8, it should be noted that he thinks some modern trends a step too far in the pacification process. He says, for example, the historical increase in the valuation of children has entered its decadent phase. Children are not allowed to be outside in the middle of the day, skin cancer, to play in the grass, deer ticks, to buy lemonade from a stand, bacteria on the lemon peel, or to lick cake batter off spoons, salmonella from uncooked eggs. One of the most valuable aspects of his description is the many graphs and tables that he gives of the ways in which violence has decreased. Typical examples are homicide rates in 5 Western European regions, 1,300 to 2,000, a timeline for the abolition of torture, one for judicial punishment and one for the abolition of worldwide slavery. Real income per person in England, 1,200 to 2,000. Literacy rate in England, 1625 to 1925. The 100 worst wars and atrocities in human history. Frequency of wars involving the great powers, 1,500 to 2,000. Probability of militarized disputes between pairs of democracies and other pairs of countries, 1825 to 1992. Rates of death and genocides, 1900 to 2008. Rape and homicide rates in the United States, 1973 to 2008. Assaults by intimate partners, United States, 1993 to 2005. Approval of spanking in the United States, Sweden and New Zealand, 1954 to 2008. And timeline for the decriminalization of homosexuality, United States and the world. So having seen now that he's done an excellent job describing the vast reduction in rates of violence over time, one other more challenging task remains to show us why it's declined as he promised in his title. And so here now I will introduce my own understanding of why violence has declined. And that is simply because civilization has progressed. And why has civilization progressed? For 2 very basic reasons. Because humans have gained more knowledge and applied it to all areas of human endeavor, and because we've learned to protect property rights better. This is the two-factor theory of civilization: knowledge and protection of property rights. An important corollary is that both variables reinforce each other either up or down. So, for example, when the barbarian hordes over time overtook the Roman Empire and destroyed its buildings and human beings and wealth, the knowledge stored in those libraries and in the heads of those human beings and their institutions, and constantly exercised and practiced and increased by their wealth, was lost, and the Dark Ages began. So the rights violations of the barbarians caused a huge loss of civilizational knowledge. On the other hand, when the knowledge of how to make a printing press was acquired, this enabled an increase in literacy and was instrumental in the Reformation, which reduced the harmful monopoly of the Catholic Church and its ability to kill and torture and fleece all of Europe of huge amounts of money. So the knowledge of the printing press led to an eventual reduction of the violence and harm exercised by Catholicism. So again, both variables reinforce each other. So having now given a description of my view of the fundamental causes which drive civilization and the rates of violence, forwards or backwards, let's examine the degree to which Dr. Pinker realizes this. In some ways, though not consistently or thoroughly, he tells us how human societies have acquired more general knowledge, which has made us more productive and thus better able to acquire what we need to live well without resorting to violence. Number one. So, for example, in the ideas of the 18th century of John Locke and Adam Smith and all the others in the Age of Reason that led to an increased understanding that institutionalized violence against criminals needed to be moderated. He says, people began to sympathize with more of their fellow human beings and were no longer indifferent to their suffering. A new ideology coalesced from these forces, one that placed life and happiness at the center of values and that used reason and evidence to motivate the design of institutions. The new ideology may be called humanism or human rights. Number two, also increased ideas about how governments should be designed. The famous checks and balances of the Founding Fathers, whose idea here came from Locke. Locke said, ambition must be made to counter ambition. And thus, the three branches enshrined in the United States Constitution and American government. Number three, Dr. Pinker describes what he calls the civilizing process, as in the improvement in manners and etiquette, but he never really mentions why human beings became less gross in their dealings with others on a daily basis. The reason was that human beings learned how to make clothing and housing and food more productively and to keep themselves more clean more easily. And so they gained, by this increased general productivity, more choices that they didn't have in previous times, and so they could choose to be less gross. Number four, he mentions the fundamental importance of Gutenberg's press, with the resulting increased literacy and production of books, saying, before Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in 1452, every copy of a book had to be written out by hand. And he notes that by the 19th century, circulating libraries were becoming quite common. Number five, the rise of literacy and the knowledge it imparted was partly important because through books, authors could write about the plight of others and thus spread the awareness of and increase the collective societal resolve to alleviate their plight. Famous examples of books here were Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which mobilized sentiment in the U.S. against slavery, Oliver Twist, which did the same thing in England for child labor, and Herman Melville's White Jacket, which helped end the flogging of sailors. Number six, his discussion about the reduction in infanticide over the centuries does sort of agree that the increased societal knowledge and the options they give are crucial. He says, the several thousand-fold reduction in infanticide enjoyed in the Western world today is partly a gift of affluence, which leaves fewer mothers in desperate straits, and partly a gift of technology in the form of safe and reliable contraception and abortion that has reduced the number of unwanted newborns. And this is exactly true. As civilization progressed, women and families had more choices derived from increased knowledge. The choice to take birth control or not, with the invention of condoms and the pill, the ease of modern abortion, not available before, the choice to have fewer children because they didn't need them as much to help out on the farm where most people lived in previous centuries, and the ability and thus choice to actually take care of children who had greater cognitive or other problems. Since if you live in a tribe in the Amazonas, you simply don't have the resources to take care of a handicapped child, or sometimes girls, both of which are less productive. As a psychologist, he understandably stresses psychological factors, saying, "The answer which has emerged from my research indicates that one of the most harmful things a human being can do is one of the most natural things a human being can do is voluntarily kill its own offspring when faced with a variety of stressful situations." Exactly. That's what society was before, much more stressful, before we gained all the knowledge to make these modern choices available. The pioneering anthropologist Edward Tyler understood this perfectly when he said, "Infanticide arises from hardness of life rather than hardness of heart." So having seen that to some degree he understands that increasing general knowledge is important in advancing civilization, and through that indirectly reducing the levels of violence, let's finally get to the protection and preservation of property rights as the second causal force in advancing civilization and reducing violence. Does he understand this, its central role? The messy answer is, in some ways he does, and in some ways he does not. Let's first focus on how he does. Number one, so as we've seen, he's already shown us how the pre-Columbian Indian skeletons with signs of violent injury among non-state Indians were 13.4% versus 2.7% for state Indians, such as the Maya and Aztec. And if alternately we look at the rates of battle deaths per 100,000 population per year, we see 524 for pre-state societies, about half that for the bloody Aztecs, and much less for other state societies. American battle deaths, for example, were only 3.7 per 100,000 per year in the 20th century. Number two, he notes, for example, in many former colonies of Africa, that once the colonizers left and the restraints of government with them, those societies became more violent as we see today. He gives here the specific example of Papua New Guinea. Number three, he notes that when the state didn't do its job in the 60s and 70s, crime skyrocketed. He says, in the United States from 1962 to 1979, the likelihood that a crime would lead to an arrest dropped from 0.32 to 0.18. The likelihood that an arrest would lead to imprisonment dropped from 0.32 to 0.14, and the likelihood that a crime would lead to imprisonment fell from 0.10 to 0.02, a factor of 5. So it's no wonder there was so much increased violence. Having surveyed some of the ways in which he shows that the state can increase the protection of property rights and thus reduce the level of violence, let's focus now on the mistakes that he makes regarding the size and scope of government. Number one, firstly, he never defines violence. So you write a whole book on the decline of violence and never bother to define it? Let's do that. What is violence? Violence is the violation of property rights. So if you slap me on the cheek against my will, that's technically violence, whether low grade or high grade. If we then use this definition, we see that while Dr. Pinker has noticed the ways in which the state has reduced interpersonal violence, He never tabulates or even recognizes much of the violence apart from homicides and war that the very powerful modern state visits on individuals. This is not surprising, coming from someone who lives, eats, and teaches in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Let's examine some of this ignored evidence. Number 1. First, modern societies have central banking, which steals money from their citizens by inflating away the money supply and creating huge booms and busts in the economy. All this accomplished by a violation of the rights of citizens to possess their own private currency or to have the state back its currency with precious metals. The result of this monetary violence? The Great Depression, for example, in which tens of millions of Americans and human beings around the world were robbed of their savings, their lives irrevocably altered and impoverished for decades to come. In Germany, the Great Depression was probably partly instrumental in the fall of the Weimar Republic and the consequent rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So, no U.S. Federal Reserve, no Great Depression, maybe no Hitler as Chancellor. Number 2, secondly, as a good Harvardian, Dr. Pinker believes in compulsory schooling, i.e. the public bad of public education. Here the state uses its taxing power to rob families of their money and subsidize a substandard and often destructive level of both K-12 and higher education. The number of both parents and children whose educational rights have been violated over close to 2 centuries in America numbers likely over 100 million, all of which would rightly have made better choices in the absence of this violent state monopoly. All of us have seen how pathetically this system, run not for children, but by the teachers' unions for the teachers' unions, performed during the COVID pandemic. None of these harms and the violence which caused them are recognized by Dr. Pinker as being attributable to his Leviathan. Number 3. Thirdly, there are numerous other harms, which lack of space limits our ability to describe here. These are, among others, the ironically named Social Security Trust Fund, which before it goes bankrupt will have stolen tens of trillions of dollars of public retirement money, its impoverished victims easily numbering in the tens of millions of Americans. The national debt, which will result in a financial catastrophe when the dollar finally crashes and is enormously devalued, and the welfare state, which damages both the productive taxpayers it steals from and the people it gives money to, resulting in enormous pathologies among poor black and increasingly poor white Americans. Because of this and the violence of other state rights violations, over 70% of black children are born to single mothers. None of these violent harms are recognized in this book as one of the costs of his Leviathan. Number 4. Now on to some other miscellaneous criticisms. Dr. Pinker rightly notes that democracies, as is often debated among civilizational theorists, are less likely to engage in warfare than other forms of government, such as monarchies or authoritarian or totalitarian governments. But what he doesn't mention is that this is precisely because democracies understand that taxation without representation is a violation of property rights, which means that the greater peacefulness of democracies is due not to being Leviathan per se, but to recognizing and respecting individual property rights through the right to vote if you're taxed. Number 5. While Dr. Pinker often condemns the efforts of individuals to deal with injustice themselves, saying vigilantism, frontier justice, taking the law into your own hands, and other forms of violent retaliation by which people secure justice in the absence of intervention by the state, are bad, he never ever mentions the enormously beneficial role of the defensive private use of firearms in reducing the levels of violence in the Anglosphere throughout the centuries. In America, in any given year, the defensive use of firearms prevents, by some estimates, potentially over 1 million crimes. And yet Dr. Pinker, who claims that liberals are smarter than conservatives, appears woefully ignorant here on a subject in which the vast majority of conservatives are well versed. Likewise, in Britain, my recent review of Joyce Lee Malcolm's guns, and violence the English experience documented both a productive tradition of hue and cry, in which both citizens and the crown cooperated to lower rates of violence by catching criminals, as well as the enormous increase in violent crime of rape, robbery, burglary, and theft that occurred in England in the latter half of the 20th century after the English right to keep and bear arms was lost. This fact, too, has escaped Pinker's purview. Number 6, and now to one last general point that Dr. Pinker never stresses, that advances in civilization did not occur because government imposes its own superior morality on its citizens, but instead because while protecting property rights, it allows the citizenry to make their own judgments about moral issues while ensuring that no citizens violate their property rights. A typical example of this, which Dr. Pinker seemed at least to partly grasp, was with infanticide. Throughout the Middle Ages, all the Christian prohibitions of infanticide achieved nothing. But once the civilizational knowledge embodied in various forms of contraceptives occurred, and once society became much more productive, so that it had many more resources to support handicapped individuals, and once easy abortion was available, infanticides were virtually eliminated. The answer then was not Leviathan, but instead increased civilizational knowledge, which gave individuals choices. The reality, however, is that this process occurs constantly in civilization in hundreds of different ways. Dr. Pinker, again, doesn't appear to grasp this process of increasing productivity and knowledge, leading to an increased number of choices, leading to better moral behavior. So how would I rate this? I would judge it in 3 different areas. A, how well he describes the actual historical reduction in violence, which is very well. B, how well he understands that increases in societal knowledge are essential to the process of reducing violence, which he gets sometimes. And C, how well he understands that a state that only protects property rights reduces violence the most. Here he doesn't shine, since he never commits himself to what violence is by defining it. So overall, I'd give him a B-. Happy now that your American football season will again be starting, in which I can celebrate and glory in enormous levels of extremely satisfying interpersonal violence. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.